Hello and welcome to the While We Speak video series. And what While We Speak tries to do is look at things that are happening on our planet right now as we're speaking. So it has that relevance of now, but it also tries to look beyond the headlines. It's not about, you know, finding a particularly troubled spot and just focusing on that for a week. It's about looking at the trends and the statistics of what's going on. It's about looking at other political cultures and economic systems. And even more deeply, it's about looking beyond your own border and trying to find out about other countries and being curious about other countries and trying to learn from other countries. So, in that spirit, today we're going to look at a country in Chile, Northern Europe, and that country is Sweden. And here it is on the map. You can see while we're staying in space here that it's between Norway here and Finland here, and it's actually connected by a tunnel to Denmark, which is the country here. So you can see it's firmly ensconced in Scandinavia. Now if we zoom in a bit more, we see the capital, which is on the eastern board of the country, Stockholm, and we see some of the major cities, which are Gothenburg here, Uppsala, and Malmö, and Helsingborg, and then we have also Gotland, which is this island here, and the city of Visby, which is around here. Now, one of the reasons Gotland is quite interesting is because I think that's originally where the Gothic tribe got its name. So whenever you hear Gothic in terms of Goths or architecture or ancient warring tribes with the Romans, you can think Gotland here. And so that's the geographic overview of Sweden, and obviously you can see in the far north it's going to be the bitterly cold, nearing the Arctic even. So it's quite a diverse country in terms of geography. But to turn to an overview of the country politically, culturally, economically, I'm going to look at an excellent web resource which I thoroughly recommend to you all, which is the New York Times website. Now on the New York Times you can type in any country in the top right here and get an article as a kind of overview of that country here. And more than that, you get statistics, brief statistics, and even more importantly, you get amazing access. You can see all these articles about Sweden, or in your case, any country that you pick, going back dozens of pages. I think, here we go, 1,315 articles. So going back a decade or more. What a treasure trove that you can delve into, and you can see stories that were bubbling up over the years and trends that have been developing over decades, rather than just focusing on what made the headlines this week. And I think there's two particularly interesting things about the overview at the beginning given here by the New York Times. One is the very first sentence. Sweden is a northern European country that is seen by many people as a guardian of liberalism and tolerance. Now, from the New York Times, that is quite an affirmation for Sweden, and it points to the reputation that Sweden has built for itself in terms of its social democratic model and the fruits of that. Now, the second interesting thing about this overview, which you can read on the New York Times website, is I think this somewhat unfortunate focus on the recent election, which was held about a month ago. And the result of that was that a somewhat far-right party gained 5.7% of the vote, and therefore in the proportional representation system of Sweden gained for the first time seats in parliament. and as you might expect, as a somewhat far-right party, it wants to cut immigration by 90% and things like that. So it's caused a bit of controversy, and is seen by some as part of the trend of a rise of the far right in Europe. But the dominant focus of it in the article on Sweden is, I think, unfortunate, because after all, Sweden has bequeathed the world such an amazing legacy in terms of its model of social democracy. You know, some would say for bad, but whether you think it's for good or bad, it's an incredible model which we can all learn lessons from, and I think that should be far more a focus of a summary of Sweden. Now, I am going to touch briefly on that election a month ago, and then move quickly on to the broader lessons from Sweden. So this is Time magazine, and a quote from Fredrik Reinfeldt, who's the current Prime Minister in a minority government and has been since 2006. And his quote about not cooperating with the Sweden Democrats, who are the somewhat far-right party. And cooperating would have meant a coalition which formed a majority, but as it is, he's relying on some green votes, so he doesn't actually have a majority at the moment. And none of the major parties are actually cooperating with this Sweden Democrat Party. But more interesting than the current configuration of the politics of Sweden, which are interesting, but I think more gripping is this narrative that goes back decades, even centuries, of social democracy in Sweden. Sweden hasn't had a war since 1814. It remained neutral during both World Wars and the Cold War, and it tried to navigate between capitalism and communism, and came up with a model which they call Folkhemmet, which in English means the people's home. And it rejects the kind of wholesale nationalisation that you see sometimes with communism, but it also rejects total unfettered capitalism. So it does impose regulations, regulations rather than government ownership. And this third way has been a model for the rest of Europe and to much of the world. Now, some would reject it. Some would say the fact that Sweden taxes an equivalent of 48% of GDP compared to, for example, 28% in the US is reason enough to reject the model. But there's so many points that could go against that argument. First, just pure democratic participation. In the recent election, 85%, there was an 85% voter turnout. That compares to, in the UK, in the 2010 election, 65%. In the US election of 2008, I think the turnout was only about 57%. So the democratic spirit in Sweden is alive and well. And you can see here some of the other fruits of this. Free education at all levels in Sweden. Free universal healthcare. And the results of these things are quite hard to argue with. If you look at the CIA World Factbook, infant mortality up here, 2.75 deaths per 1,000 live births. That is incredibly low. In the US it's 6 deaths per 1,000, in the UK 5 deaths per 1,000. 2.75 deaths, that means only Bermuda and Singapore have better rates of saving infants at age 1 or younger. That's an incredible success story. And then life expectancy, 81 years, 9th best in the world. Again, even in GDP terms, in pure economic terms, I think their GDP is nearing $40,000, which is higher than Germany, France, and the UK. And it's more than about cold statistics. You know, Sweden is quite a funky country with great cities as well. I'm sorry if I'm sounding a bit like a travel agent, but it's true, I think. If you look at Stockholm, ranked one of the most innovative cities in Europe, strongest GDP growth forecast, one of the most greenest and livable cities in the world. And I don't know how they found this one out, but one of the world's top 10 honest cities. It's Europe's first ever green capital of 2010. So as a city, as a country, and as a social democratic model, Sweden is a fascinating country.